Expectations are the baggage of accomplishment. If you're from software in the late 90s and you've made a name for yourself delivering highly iterative and forward-thinking 5th gen dungeon crawlers and Armored Core, then surprise surprise, people are going to start to bring expectations with them when you release a new dungeon crawler series which is built on top of the foundations of your last dungeon crawler series. And unfortunately for you, if you are indeed from software, those expectations, although unprovoked by you, will malign gamers against your new outing should it not stack up, regardless of the game's quality in a vacuum. Hello everyone, I'm AesirAesthetics, and yes, once again in my From Software analysis series, we are paying tribute to our friends in media criticism and are detailing how they got From Software games wrong. See, measured against Kingsfield, Shadow Tower is an odd duck. If you regard any of the Kingsfield games as the baseline of quality 5th gen dungeon crawling, then Shadow Tower might make you upset because shockingly, it's not a Kingsfield game. And if you thought you were gonna see a new series iterate on the most celebrated aspects of Kingsfield 3, you know, the more open world, again, you are going to be let down because Shadow Tower goes back to a dungeon setting. Or if, like some other critics, you just wanted to play Doom, again, too bad. A work is not bad because someone brought unreasonable expectations going in which were not delivered on, and since Shadow Tower got capital H hurt by unfair expectations, in this video I'm going to try to give what I consider to be a genuinely good game with a lot of interesting concepts going for it, the fair shake it didn't get at release. I'll be making more comparisons to other games than I usually do, specifically comparisons to the Kingsfield games, so I hope you're familiar with them before watching. If not, I made videos on all 4, which you can watch before proceeding. With that out of the way, please grab yourself a cup of coffee, tea is also acceptable, as we take a look back at Shadow Tower. If Kingsfield 3 was how FromSoft made a masterpiece by stripping out the crap from the previous games and iterating on what worked, then Shadow Tower is how FromSoft makes a masterpiece from the stripped out crap. The disposed of material from Kingsfield makes a triumphant return in Shadow Tower along with some new mechanics in the service of delivering on an altered mood. Kingsfield 3 was a pretty perfect game, everything considered. But if there was a genuine grievance to be had with it, you could argue that it backpedaling on the intricate level design from the second game made for an experience which was undeniably more artificial than what had preceded it. Because they were conceptually smaller, Kingsfield 1 and 2's world design managed to feel believable in a way Kingsfield 3's didn't. Kingsfield 3 leaned more on characters to flesh out its world than it did dungeon crawling, and because of how it distributed dungeons on the map and how much more time was spent in the connective tissue between dungeons, the dungeon crawling there was arguably the most bare bones in that franchise. Kingsfield 1 had a hard time contextualizing the narrative in the environmental design. In the early game, before memorization sets in, Kingsfield 2's levels are so samey and generic looking that the world ranges from impeccable to just a hassle to navigate. And while I think Kingsfield 3 solved both of those issues, it did so by fracturing the world design and making the game a lot more artificial feeling. If we are evaluating each game on how good their dungeon crawling is, the more Zelda dungeon approach which Kingsfield 3 took could easily be seen as a massive downgrade. I love all 3 games, but I can zoom out a bit and understand why they weren't staple features of 90s console gaming. The trilogy is unpolished, experimental very often to a fault, internally inconsistent in how it communicates with the player, and let's be honest here, for the average gamer, even at the time, ugly to look at, painful to play. This being said, we have to solve a conundrum. I'll posit that Shadow Tower is a stronger dungeon crawler than any of the 3 preceding Kingsfields, But if that's so, how is it that its legacy isn't any grander? How can it simultaneously be a better entry into this niche and still be less beloved? I think it all comes back to fundamentally incorrect expectations. There is a number which might explain why Shadow Tower never reached the heights its quality design might have warranted. It's a very special number, most gamers know quite well, and I'm gonna share it with you now in hopes of illustrating my point. 1998. The year Resident Evil 2 came out and expanded on the series, which laid the groundwork for survival horror. The year of Half-Life and Thief the Dark Project, revolutionizing the first-person experience and forever changing players' expectations of games in this display paradigm. The year Metal Gear Solid and Grim Fandango injected some serious cinematic storytelling into the medium, and the year of Ocarina of Time. In terms of evolving the video game art form, this was quite possibly the most adventsome year in console gaming history, and this was the year Shadow Tower came and knocked it out of the park in terms of showcasing just what a 5th gen console-locked dungeon crawler could be. Arguably, this game was when From Software perfected this game design formula, but by 1998 it was already too late. Gamers' expectations had moved too far away from it for this game to truly resonate, and if you compare Shadow Tower's rating to Kingsfield's, which never quite got the love either, it's an abysmal mess. Shadow Tower struggled to crack a 30% aggregate approval rating. But reviews come and go, and in the end, all that matters is what you felt. Reviewers might have poo-pooed what they got, but I won't hesitate to argue that this is a solid game. In fact, if this had been what Kingsfield 1 had launched as, it would probably have been very fondly remembered. It is incredibly forward-thinking considering the era on how to make a game like this, and it also has some genuine guts. It strips out elements from Kingsfield which made those games easier, and it includes new elements which make this game harder, in service of a new creative direction, one much darker in tone and nature. You need only look at the box art and compare it to Kingsfield to know that this is a very different feeling game. Just ignore that the Shadow Tower guy has cock and balls around his neck. Cannot unsee. And for most of it, I think it successfully adapts the Kingsfield formula to this new dark feeling. It's more oppressive and much, much harsher. Many of you watching will have felt the sting of losing tens of thousands of souls in Dark Souls, but Shadow Tower doesn't even guarantee that you'll have a weapon to fight with all throughout. Kingsfield might have been mired in bizarre design decisions, but Shadow Tower is a darn goldmine for this stuff. Shadow Tower is a first-person dungeon crawler with slow movement, slow combat, high difficulty, and obtuse player direction, so in true From Software tradition, we have to rewind a bit before we start the game because the story actually begins in the game's manual. You know, we take it for granted that games have the memory capacity to contain their entire text, because back in the day, designers were very clever to include stories in booklets. The prologue given there goes, "The continent Eclipse. Here lies the Holy Land of Scepter. In this land is a sealed tower that is guarded by the kings of surrounding nations according to the traditions passed down from their ancestors. They whisper a prayer that the disaster will not repeat itself. It happened a long time ago. A tragedy descended upon the kingdom of Eclipse, from which this continent drew its name. There is a crown with a single eye, that terrible gaze which snuffed out the kingdom of Eclipse in one night, leaving nothing but a gargantuan hole, a fearsome power that led a prosperous king into total destruction. Always wearing that crown, the king looked smug. This crown is the source of our power. It is how we became the conqueror, so the king would say. That single eye that glowed so ominously before is now closed and quietly sealed within the tower. It was as if it had fallen into an eternal sleep. The secrets behind the ancient tragedy will never be known. The peace in the Holy Land of Zepter looked as though it would last forever, like it was forgotten that this was a cursed soil. And the story goes, the number of mercenaries on the continent has recently increased. They claimed no nation and operated solely for their own gain, making their way by force. One of those men, Roose Hardy, set out on a journey in search of a new position. The town of Zepter was the crossroad of the nations, and there lived a gentle granny who tended the inn. She cared for him back when his career was just beginning. Guess I'll stop by Granny's for a meal, it's been a long time. Roose could see her stern yet kind smile in his mind. He did not know his parents. Hers had been the first warmth he had experienced, and he has always drawn strength from that. But all that greeted Roose as he came through the woods in the dusk was a mound of rubble. There was no sign of anyone nearby. He caught his breath and looked up at the sky. The tower, always standing so proud, was not there. Only the base of the tower remained, looking lonely, as if the entire town had been sucked into the tower's depths. Roose, standing there in disbelief, sensed someone approaching and whirled around. "Who is it?" An old man dressed in a robe was standing there. "I am the monk called to guard the tower through the generations. Judging from your longsword, you must be Vedden, Earl of Midas. How astute of you to discern the situation so quickly." Roose was about to tell him he had the wrong man, but the old man continues, "The souls of those who lived here were consumed by those in the realm of evil beneath the tower. If their souls are brought back, they could possibly be saved, but my power is not enough to confront the evil ones. Several have gone down, but it is unlikely that they will return alive. Man-made weapons are useless against them. Time is running out. In just a few short days, the door to the darkness beneath the tower will be closed, and those whose souls were consumed will never be saved. There is no choice but to rely on you. You still have the choice to say no and walk away. And how can the souls be saved?" The old man answered Roose's query. "The souls that were consumed by the Dark Ones are now a part of their power. They can be released by conquering the Dark Ones who trapped the souls. The most important thing is to find the key to restore the souls to their original bodies, the one-eyed crown. Thereafter, you will be guided. This is a treasured sword passed down in my family through the generations. They say it is a Dark One's sword, but no one truly knows. Nevertheless, I am certain that this sword will be your only hope. Take it with you." And with that, the old man gave him an age-old sword. "You want me to go down that hole with just this sword?" Roose stared down at the unlikely weapon, muttering, "The Dark Ones," spoken of by this monk, "so powerful they cannot be conquered by man-made weapons. If I enter this hole, will I ever come back? Wouldn't it be better to tell him he had the wrong man and run away?" But then in his mind he saw Granny's smile, and he could taste her good, simple cooking. Roose sighed softly and descended down into the hole beneath the tower. In Kingsfield 1, we saw a brave hero of light descend into a royal catacomb to destroy the evil which had taken root there. In Kingsfield 2, we saw a noble knight venture to a dangerous monster-infested island to retrieve the magical sword of his king. In Kingsfield 3, we saw the Prince of Light travel through his kingdom to gain the strength to confront his corrupted father and save his soul before destroying the evil dragon god which had corrupted him. In Shadow Tower, we play as a guy who wants grandma's soup. For real though, All of Kingsfield's love of fantasy, both earnest and the more introspective, is here. The major difference is that, unlike Kingsfield's, Shadow Tower's story is not uplifting at its core. This is very bleak fantasy, where the hearts of men are tested and all are found to be weak, and where the crown of the king makes monsters out of men. The first instance of gameplay has us positioned at the top of the staircase of the titular Shadow Tower. Like dungeon crawling would have you expect, our goal is to go down, and to facilitate that goal, the tower is inverted. It's kinda built underground, so you enter it from the top and the stairs let you descend. Simple enough. At the start, if we were to reverse course and try to get out of the tower, the entrance will cave in on itself, leaving us only the choice to stand still or descend. This is a very small detail, but it adds a sort of permanence to our predicament, which I really like. Something I don't like about the opening, however, is how we're back to a text crawl to get the story going. Hindsight is 2020, I know, but surely the text crawl at the beginning should have spent more time talking about how the stability of the separate kingdoms is fraying and how you are a mercenary whose allegiance is bought. Talked about your character's immediate backstory, and it should have ended by saying something like, "And now you've returned to the town to meet the kind old lady of your past once more." Then you should have walked around the town, which would have been empty except for the base of the tower where you would have met the old man who told you about the evil within. Kingsfield 1 had this same problem, because it opened the same way. Same problem, on a much grander scale, because of its poor capacity for environmental storytelling. The game has a really hard time investing me in the larger conflict outside of the tower, and I think emphasizing the disunity of the kingdoms and the disappearance of the citizens of the village would have gone some ways to explain why the evil is surging. The protectors have forgotten it and are warring with each other, but it'd also give you a baseline to which you could compare the dungeons to. Even if it had been something as simple as 4 empty houses and a road leading to a tower. My favorite improvement Kingsfield 3 made from 2 was the world building, and while I recognize Shadow Tower as a homecoming back to dungeon crawling, I would have appreciated for a bit more care to have been placed into making the world outside the tower feel important. I know I just had a whole spiel about expectations, so I should note that this isn't just in comparison to Kingsfield 3. In the abstract, I feel like a more gameplay-driven introduction to the world and our character's motive is almost always better than a text crawl. In comparing this introduction to Kingsfield 1, however, Shadow Tower fares off a lot better, I think. Kingsfield and Shadow Tower are going for radically different moods. Both are dark and depressing fantasy games, but as I already noted, Kingsfield at its core is hopeful, Shadow Tower not so much. Taking this altered mood into consideration, compared to the Kingsfields, I think this samey opening plays a bit better here, if only because it emphasizes that your character doesn't really matter. Kingsfield 1 and 2 opened very similar to each other. Kingsfield 3 started with the player being gifted a magical sword and told who they were, so there was a bit of grandeur to that intro. Anyway, Kingsfield 1 and 2 opened very similarly, both to each other, but also to what Shadow Tower opens like. But since both of those games were going for a magical hero story, maybe a more heroic intro would have been in order for them. Here, that the opening is fairly unimpressive, but for the fact that it places no emphasis on your greatness and does nothing to make you feel powerful or great, contributes to the tone of the game more than it did in Kingsfield 1 or Kingsfield 2. There is no great celebration to mark your entrance, and the generic blob enemies at the start are easily capable of taking you out. Finally, since your levels are low, your movement speed is slow, so once you start playing, you kinda feel like trash. The game plays much like Kingsfield 3 did, for better and worse. The button mapping remains atrocious with no way to change it, but like always, This becomes a non-issue once you've been playing for like 30 minutes and every input has become intuitive. These games were not coded to take advantage of analog sticks, but here's a friendly tip to any time-traveling game designer looking to make their 90s FPS game play better on a console. Movement should be controlled with the D-pad, and if your game involves a lot of elevation differences, the face buttons should be used as a secondary D-pad to control camera movement. Combat and interactions should be mapped to the bumper and trigger buttons. Anyways, in the beginning, the game sets up scenarios where we can learn to move around, fight, read lore, pick up items, and fiddle around with the menus. The beginning level is a catacomb with some secret rooms, and the subsequent area is a dungeon, meaning the layout of the tower must have had some consideration done to instill the game with a dark mood from the start. I say that because there are some levels later on which are a bit silly in comparison, so I think for tonal reasons, front-loading some dark, moody environments was either a good design decision or a real stroke of luck. Probably the former though, let's be honest. Although I think the game does a poor job of communicating why the world outside of the tower should be important, the actual tower itself is another story. For one, there's more environmental storytelling here than there was in the preceding Kingsfields. There's also a stronger sense of thematic resonance, and not just in the levels. There are fewer goofy weapons here than in the Kingsfields, and weapon placements feel very reasonable. And I don't just mean in the sense that there aren't machine guns here, that'd be ridiculous, right? But in the sense that you aren't just opening chests for rewards or buying the most powerful stuff in the game from some random civilian like we often saw in Kingsfield. As it is in most 3D games, the story is mapped to environmental progression. They advance in parallel, things happen when you are there to witness them happening. The first screen of gameplay directs the player to descend, and that will be the overarching goal for the duration of the game. Reach further and further down to find the one-eyed crown. How about that? Didn't even try to make that rhyme, that's just how good the game is. Expectations might have had you thinking that the expansion to Kingsfield 3 would do away with level segmenting altogether and try to map out an adventure in an open world. Kingsfield 1 has open levels connected at choke points. The second Kingsfield has an open and interconnected map you unlock as you advance. Kingsfield 3 is a mix of both. The overworld connects to areas in a mostly linear fashion, and the overworld connects to other overworlds in a linear fashion, but the dungeons in the world are more open. So, like I said, it seems like the next logical step would be a totally open world, which might explain why people were mad that Shadow Tower goes back to linear gauntlets. The reality is actually that Shadow Tower is segmented harder than Kingsfield 1 was, and its levels are more cramped than in any Kingsfield, making them better directed, more thematically resonant, and more stressful to navigate. As for the segmenting of the world, here, the stairs of the tower are disconnected at points, which means you need to enter biome-specific levels, internally called regions, and thread your way through them to get down further. There are often branches where you can choose which order you descend the rooms in, but the overall goal is to keep going down. Instantly, anyone will notice that the texture work has seen a dramatic improvement from the Kingsfield days, and another big change is that there's no ambient music. We also have a limited draw distance, making the world claustrophobic, though it's likely here for aiding processing. Something cool about limited draw distances is that since they tune out visibility, archaic and empty worlds don't really feel as underdeveloped as they might if you could see them in their completeness. You don't ask why isn't there X furniture in X room when the game gives you the illusion that it might be there just outside of your immediate vision. Because of the limited draw distance, combat's element of the unknown is raised. You don't see the enemies coming all the time, so you need to be on your guard. In general, combat is mostly true to its Kingsfield predecessors, attack enemies, walk around them to not be hit back, magic is gradually unlocked, etc. The touches which differentiate Shadow Tower are how healing works, how item degradation works, how defense works, how enemies themselves work, and how magic works. Defense this time around is more interactive in that you have to actually raise your shield in order for it to calculate into your overall defense. Enemies are a bit more varied in how they are best fought, and they also don't respawn as aggressively as in Kingsfield, so there's a sense of actually accomplishing something when you kill them. For healing, you're picking up flasks which restore your HP, like in Kingsfield, but later on you can equip passive healing items. Interestingly though, there are occasional shops around the map which let you trade in items for healing flasks, and oh my lord, they did it. They fixed the broken economy from Kingsfield. See, it's not just the item degradation shouldering more directorial duties than usual, the economy itself is also doing some heavy lifting, and actually, the two are connected in that the economy plays into item degradation. Remember in my Kingsfield 4 video when I lamented that item degradation didn't direct the experience more? Well, I sure got my wish. Armors, shields, weapons, rings, they all degrade with use, or when you touch corrosive water and once an item is broken, it becomes unusable. This is probably the hardest degradation system I've ever played with. Most items we pick up are half broken at the start. Also, note the difference between Kingsfield and Shadow Tower here. Both have you use a depleting pool of mana to cast spells, but Kingsfield had you pick up crystals and learn the spells. Shadow Tower has you equip rings to get the spells. Rings, which as I noted earlier, break with use. The harsh item degradation system might have you think, whatever, I'll just trade my broken items for healing flasks at the item trading shops. But if you do, congratulations. You've just made the game harder for yourself because those items could have been restored and you should have kept them because restored, even crappy items, are most often more useful than healing items. This game's economy is very vicious. A big change from Kingsfield, which helps make Shadow Tower all the more oppressive, is the absence of a map. Areas are incredibly dark, and since you don't have a map, you need to resort to pen and papering your way through, memorization, or the internet to get the lay of the land. And since the save points, item shops, and restoration shops, where you trade health to restore items, are not guaranteed to be in every level, when you stumble upon one of these, you need to take serious stock of your inventory and make a projection on your prospects for advancing. So the game does the whole manual save points distributed across the map. This time they are represented as tombstones. So there will be times when you have 30 minutes of progress on the line, and as I've said on this channel before and will continue saying, this simple addition of stakes can turn even subpar gameplay into something truly engaging. The Shadow Tower experience is as much a dungeon crawler as it is a spreadsheet manager where everything keeps going to the toilet and you're constantly working not with what you want but with what you have. You're mostly mitigating, not taking initiative. And the heavy penalty for dying is how this system keeps you going. It's always a relief to find a save point or store, but the decision making in regards to buying health or saving your broken equipment because you might be able to restore it and make use of it later is a constant stress-inducing moment hanging over you with every step you take, until about the mid-game, when the game starts to give you equipment which has passive healing qualities, a FromSoft staple to signify growth. Once you have that equipment, you might just spend some minutes regaining health and instantly using it to fund the restoration of your equipment. The health and the degradation systems do not comprise the entire economy in the game. Strewn around the map and dropped from select enemies is a currency known as coons, which will allow us to buy items at coon shops. In those shops we can always buy healing flasks, and just like that, this shop is integrated into the health economy. The game's central currency is not the coons, but health. Every market connects to it, and in fact, every interaction connects to it. Progressing through levels means taking hits from enemies, fixing your equipment, the things you use to survive and advance through the levels costs health. Health costs either healing flasks, which are found on the map or purchased with the coon coins, which are better spent on level up items and mana potions, or it costs the very equipment you desperately need to survive and would rather use your health to restore. And of course, enemies and areas can deal not only active damage but passive damage, like curses or poisons, which drain your health and mana, or they can deal just straight up corrosive damage to destroy your items. So the game rarely has you make proactive decisions about what to do before progressing. You are usually making the best of what you've got left and dealing with whatever ailments preceding areas left you with. If you want to know how aggressive the item degradation system is in this game, by the end of my second playthrough, the one where I finally beat the game, I still had my starting gear in my inventory because I would go through my equipment fast enough all throughout the game that I never had a really strong stock of undamaged and unused equipment in my inventory when I got to trading inventory for health. I never had enough of an overstock that I felt comfortable trading in my starting gear. Now admittedly, I was very thorough in exploration, but still, using health as a central currency seems to be the major change-up that will turn the busted economy in Kingsfield into a really capable gameplay director for stressing the player out. Leveling up here is interesting because armors and weapons have specific qualities which add to levels passively. Additionally, there is no item locked behind a level wall. There are items called soul pods which let you raise selected levels, and you get levels as you kill enemies. One hang-up I have here is that the game does not, or at least I couldn't find it, does not communicate what a level specifically does. I had to go online to find that, and shockingly, the only levels which matter are strength, defense, spirit, and speed. Health increases passively with levels, and so does mana. Strength manages damage output, defense and spirit minimize damage taken, physical and magical respectively, and speed controls your movement speed. Remember how in Dark Souls 2, everyone got mad when From Software attached iframes to the agility stat? This is what I think they were initially going for, but might not have factored in that Shadow Tower doesn't penalize the player for wearing heavy armors. Movement in Shadow Tower is clunky and slow at the start, but it gets better when you start wearing speed-granting apparel and start leveling up your speed. It's funny to think about in the abstract, but wearing a full suit of metal armor will make you faster than being nude in this game. In the context of play, however, this is very intuitive, and since there's no downsides to wearing heavy armors, and since there's no level wall for any of your items, there isn't a single item which you will obviously never use. So parting with a piece of equipment, regardless of the potential upsides, always has a bit of a sting to it. Add to that the stat increases worn items also increase your max health while you wear them, meaning equipment is always on upside, so trading it in is always a tough choice. So I noted earlier that it wasn't until my second playthrough that I managed to beat the game. See, strictly speaking, Shadow Tower is not fair. It has a hard time communicating what is and what is not a viable strat at given moments. Certain enemies feel way too strong for what their design communicates. There are paralysis spells which can legit just lock you out of the game if you get caught in a loop of being hit by them. The game does a poor job of communicating challenges ahead, so you might go into a hallway with half your health, have the hallway spray fire at you, be safe in the middle, but unable to go forwards or backwards without dying. If we define a game's fairness as that game being consistent in language, that is, not radically altering output for elements after conditioning the player to expect a certain output, if we define it as guaranteeing the player the ability to overcome any challenge, and if we define it as the game being reasonable with what it expects of the player, then no. Strictly speaking, Shadow Tower is not fair. But that's not inherently a bad thing. Fairness gets a lot of hype, but there are things it cannot communicate. So it's not like fairness is inherently what games should strive for. If, for example, you want the player to feel that the world they are playing in is cruel, that it is unfair, what do? If your answer is make the game secretly fair but trick the player into thinking it's unfair, then you have either wasted your time since the player was gonna think the world was unfair anyways, or if the player manages to read the secret fairness, failed to make the world feel unfair. Shadow Towers' world doesn't care about you. We are constantly meeting monsters who tell us that we're nobodies, that we'll never be a king. If the narrative wants to make a point out of emphasizing the player's lack of importance, then I think it's a totally valid move, ludologically speaking, to have the game be unfair. Your mileage may vary, and this might not have been the best way to accomplish this mood, seeing as it's going to alienate a lot of people, but that's a very different conversation. For Shadow Tower, unfairness communicates the player's lack of importance. Your character was mistaken for a hero and dumped into the adventure. It's not fun to have all of your items degrade and not have a weapon you can use, but it gets you to take the threats seriously because things can go wrong very fast and an entire hour of gameplay can be destroyed with just a minute of bad reactions. Remember how in my Kingsfield videos I would often remark that each game's final gauntlet was very System Shock-esque in how they ratchet up the difficulty so excessively that enemies feel like they aren't even meant to be fought? That's like the baseline experience in Shadow Tower. Now, don't get the wrong idea. The game isn't sadistic. You aren't thrown down a hole with no escape from. You aren't killed by invisible enemies. If you take care, if you prepare and play like a sensible person, you can make it to the end and survive every blow of unfairness thrown your way. It's just that, however skilled you are, however carefully you play, on a first playthrough, you will get hit a lot, and no amount of skill can negate that. You are going to feel just how unfair the game can be, and you're going to have to heal a lot from damage you took, which you're not gonna feel was fair for you to take. Here's an interesting note though. Unlike Kingsfield, the healing does not at any point come across as a means of compensating for the bad combat or the bad area challenges. Because of the health economy, combat's unreliability now actually serves to highlight a central thematic goal. And because of it, all the worst aspects of the Kingsfields, the underwhelming combat, the slow movement, the horrendous economy, the obtuse storytelling, comes together in Shadow Tower in a very masterful way. With a few turns of the valve, Shadow Tower makes a great game by emphasizing some of the worst aspects of the Kingsfield trilogy. The game I've hesitated the most to compare Shadow Tower to in this video so far is Kingsfield 4. The reason for this is that it launched after this game, so making comparisons between the two is not in the spirit of things, considering it was informed by lessons learned here. Kingsfield 4 is a very jarring title to compare to its predecessors, and that's because it's not picking the thread up from Kingsfield 3, because FromSoft kept experimenting with the formula in other franchises. Critics seemingly did not pick up on how, but Shadow Tower, in spite of appearances, is about as logical a step from Kingsfield 3 as that game was from Kingsfield 2, provided you didn't bring the expectation of seeing an open world. Every Kingsfield game, to me, seems to have been highly tuned to fixing the perceived issues of its predecessors. Like I said earlier, Kingsfield 1 had a hard time contextualizing narrative, so Kingsfield 2 is set in a more vibrant world with more characters who are able to pick up the slack of storytelling when the limited graphical capabilities of the PlayStation 1 dropped the ball. But that game had a hard time separating its segments due to its often samey looking environments, which undermines its ability to direct the player with level design, and so Kingsfield 3 does a much harder segmenting by doing away with the interconnected world design altogether and making each area biome specific. But that meant each hub connected to gauntlets, which was very artificial, and that's what Shadow Tower innovates on. I think the reason critics missed it is because the world design, the game taking place in a tower, seems like a step backwards, and because they had expectations of something bigger than what they saw last time. Shadow Tower can get away with its deviations from Kingsfield by simply saying, it's a different game with different aspirations, but it doesn't even need to do that, because even though it reintegrated and redeemed a lot of the crappy design decisions which the Kingsfields had been dumping over time, it's still a step forwards from where Kingsfield 3 left off. An important instance on building on what came before is with our protagonist, who sees arguably the most nuanced evolution from last time around. What Roose Hardy shares with the Kingsfield protagonists is the same gradual gameplay arc. Every one of these men began their adventures as weak, compared to the threats they faced, as under-equipped, under-informed about the dangers ahead, and each of these men are more or less faceless vectors you overwrite. What makes Roose Hardy different is mainly two things. One, he does not grow into a grander role like his predecessors did, and two, the gameplay is better tuned to presenting his character. For the first point, let's explore the ending. We descend the tower and kill kings and monsters until we reach the absolute bottom. The king's guardian, Valstat, circa 98, shows up and fights you. Once you beat him, he will strip naked and reveal himself to be a lizard. Okay, but then you kill him again and hear the ailing sounds of the Conqueror King, the owner of the one-eyed crown, and then you come face to face with Demon Souls' King of Land, circa 98. Yeah, I didn't want to talk a lot about the Souls series in this video, but I just can't not mention this stuff. If Kingsfield laid the groundwork for Souls gameplay, then Shadow Tower lays the ground for Souls ambience, and there's about as much story pilfered from here as there was from the Kingsfields. Anyways, the king in the bottom of the tower is the host of corruption. He looks like a gargantuan flubber baby, and he does a lot of damage, but isn't all that hard, which is good. The fight preceding it was the hardest in the game, and the king's appearance is a reveal which loses its impact if you'd have had to see it 10 times before closing the game out. It's probably best that the king is relatively easy. It means he's not a skill challenge you overcome to prove you've conquered Shadow Tower, he's more of an ambient piece. And he is satisfying to beat because he's closing off the entire experience. At the end, we are treated to a cutscene which shows our character drop to his knees as he's losing strength, desperately searching for the crown. An ominous form appears and asks the player why they seek the crown, and then says it has the power to grant any wish. When the player asks, any wish? We see a cutscene of the crown's previous owner standing over his kingdom, which means the form we are talking to is likely the spirit or soul of the king we just slew. It explains that the crown made him a conqueror. We see the crown blink, and then credits. No vision of the future, no magical deity come to tell you that your guy is actually a holy king of light. You watch our protagonist reach journey's end, come face to face with the evil of the tower, learn its nature, find the one-eyed crown, and then the game ends. Did we save the souls of the town? Did we return, crown in hand, and become a conqueror? Who knows? The game doesn't care about your character after the adventure ends, so the lack of emphasis the game placed on him at the start and all throughout rings very true. As for the second point I raised, there is no hidden sword quest which underlines how your guy is actually a chosen one of destiny. The game is good at presenting the character in that the level ups are mostly hidden away from you to make growth feel more natural, and in that the game never serves you a special quest to contrast the rest of the dour experience. You start the game and everyone calls you worthless. You end the game and no divine entity in the interim has stopped to tell you that actually you're a really good guy with a strong soul or whatever, like they did in Kingsfield. The foes you meet all tell you that you're garbage. The enemies can kill you if you just position yourself wrong for a few seconds. It really feels like Roos's lack of defined character in the game's story was a deliberate choice by FromSoft to contrast Kingsfield, where every character had some sort of destiny. To put this into context, 1998 was the year when 3D games came into their own. This was the year when the industry got more and more interested in what characters and cinematic storytelling could add to games. Kingsfield served as a solid gameplay bedrock on which to add some sort of cinematic story, but instead, Shadow Tower went back to gameplay. It is less interested in cinema than Kingsfield 3, and that is pretty interesting. Every Kingsfield game was shredded by reviewers for having terrible gameplay, but when the industry gave FromSoft the opportunity to levy cinema to prop up their narrative, FromSoft opted not to. Maybe this was a miscalibration, maybe this was an earnest desire by FromSoft to resolve the issues they had with Kingsfield. And if Shadow Tower is From Software's answers to the criticism of Kingsfield's gameplay, it's a pretty daring answer. It doesn't fix what people complained about, it doubles down on it, and I, as someone who enjoyed the Kingsfield games, feel it totally pays off. Instead of abandoning the bad elements of Kingsfield, Shadow Tower reframes them to serve a new creative vision, and for it, it's a very satisfying dungeon crawler. Shadow Tower redeems the worst design decisions from Kingsfield by recontextualizing and reframing them to fit a new ludological aim. The gameplay is still used to deliver the dark mood, it's still mapping narrative progression to environmental progression, it's still the same protagonist role, it's still the same game, for the most part. But it jettisons a lot of the quality of life mechanics and improvements Kingsfield made as it progressed as a series, and it doubles down on what critics hated at the time. And as time has gone on, the game, hated at launch, has developed a real cult following. Like the Kingsfields, I wouldn't recommend Shadow Tower to everyone because I think most people would simply not get into it enough to appreciate its niche. Unlike the Kingsfields, however, expectations played a big part in my appreciation of the game. I usually don't talk so much about other games when I go over a title, but so much of my appreciation of Shadow Tower was watching the stuff I disliked about Kingsfield be refitted into mechanics I genuinely love. It's a solid game on its own, but once I saw what it was doing, I became more interested in the game as a work than as a solitary experience. Your mileage may vary, but for me, as good as the game was, I was more impressed by it as a technical work. If anything, it showcases that there is no such thing as a bad mechanic, only bad utilizations. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned, because next week we'll be going over The Last Guardian. We did it! I'm still operating this channel on the bi-monthly release schedule, where every month I swap between making some videos for you guys and making my game. Last month I began putting together a vertical slice demo / proof of work for my game, which I'm going to release, free to play of course, at the end of June. I hope you'll check it out and give me feedback on what you think works and what you think doesn't. I currently have 3 ideas for how the completed game should be assembled, and the feedback for the demo will be instrumental for me deciding on which direction to take. If this interests you, I recommend subscribing and clicking the bell icon to receive notifications. I also like and comment for all of that good old interacting with the algorithm. Special thanks to Casitive for helping me understand the story, and to meauxdal, Lotus Prince, SnazzyAI, and WorldofLongplays, as played by Deskawa, for providing me with the footage. Links to all these great channels are located in the description box below. Also linked below is my Patreon, which is where funding for these videos comes from and where I give early access to videos to members. Right now you can catch the Last Guardian analysis early for as little as $1. I hope this video was worth the time you spent watching it. I've been AesirAesthetics, and until next time, take care.